Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on logic, philosophy, and Lord Bertrand Russell, who lived from 1872 to 1970. He was born into one of the most prominent aristocratic families of Britain and retained the title Lord, even when arrested and jailed for demonstrating as a pacifist and socialist against the First World War. Russell distinguished his own logical empiricism, or logical positivism, from that of the earlier British empiricists Locke, Hume, and Berkeley, arguing that empiricism could learn with Boole and Frege to analyze using the method of mathematics and logic and arrive at pure certainty. Is there such a thing other than certainty itself? Not just in the ideals of the mind, but in the physical world that was mechanizing in modernity. Further, since Sumer, Russell argued against Hegel and Mill, who had strong followings in Britain at the time, and claimed that Boole was a modern Copernicus. Bertrand Russell opened his 1929 essay, Mathematics and the Metaphysicians, saying the 1800s prided itself on the steam engine and evolution, but it might have more legitimately claimed fame from Boole's discovery of pure mathematics. Again, remember, Boole died in obscurity, with not much attention to his work, and Russell claims he is Copernicus himself and still unrecognized. Russell also famously said, mathematics can be defined as the subject in which we never know what we are talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true, which is very much what Boole and also Carroll, it's not only nonsense worthy of Lewis Carroll, but Russell was known jokingly as the Mad Hatter of Trinity College, Cambridge, with his friends McTaggart and G.E. Moore, known as the March Hare and the Dormouse. Together, the Mad Tea Party of Trinity. This is where Wittgenstein came and back and forth to do what I believe is quite Copernican work. But opposite the work of Boole, actually, because Wittgenstein's later work, which I consider to be more Copernican than his truth tables, is actually in opposition to what Boole was doing. But what Boole did was very useful in many ways and helped organize mathematics and logic and lots of things. So I think more logic than mathematics, but yes, and all of that, more and more and more in opposite directions. So, but in logic, we do know that in formal logic, you are actually posing things hypothetically. If A, then B, then C. So you technically do not ever know in abstract logic what you are saying is true because you are posing it as an abstract hypothetical. So you do not know if what you are saying is true, which is the second part of that quote. And math is something in which we do not know what we are talking about. Well, if we're talking about pure quantities, quanta, I don't know if that is even correct in the verbiage, that they're undefined quantities. They are, well, that other than quantities, in a certain sense, pure mathematics, this pure certainty, is nothing in particular. Not radishes, not human emotions, not nothing. So it is defined as the subject in which we do not know what we are talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true. Now, funny enough, Russell does believe in this kind of certainty, and he does believe in it for the sciences. Now, that is quite Kantian, but again, oddly enough, for such Kantian one strain of German thought, these sorts of analytic, proto-analytic thinkers are actually going to do something rather un-Kantian, which is they're going to try to find absolute certainty, but here we have a very big problem, which I think is very Wittgenstein, and very much what sets me up to then lecture a lot on Wittgenstein, is that they want pure certainty of pure numbers, but then they want it in the hairiness of the world. So they want math and physics, and then they want to predict where the orange is going to go next week. But the problem is that then now we don't have pure quantities anymore, and so what do we know with absolute certainty? And then usually what this sort of thinking says is, well, now we know what is most absolutely certain. But that actually does create, gulfs that Kant either created or did not address that Hegel is upset about, and Russell is as upset with Hegel. So Carroll was in his Wonderland. I do think it is very clear that Carroll is mocking Aristotle throughout, and I think that he is mocking Boole at the Mad Tea Party, which would make sense then that Russell doing similar kinds of thinking was also known in general as having identifiable traits with that Russell himself was much the Mad Hatter, which is what I think that Carroll is saying somewhat of Boole, and that kind of understanding. If we just take formal math timeless, because time is dead at the Tea Party, or at least is upset and won't speak to the Tea Party, and they continue to be rude and foolish because they do not develop, because they are dealing with empty abstractions, like a formal hat of sorts that isn't his. Isn't the Hatter, because it's impersonal. It's not individual. Abstract logic would not be personal or individual if it's formal and universal. So the Carroll was at Oxford, and so Cambridge is the secondary upstart, hundreds of years old now, but I think 200, 300 years younger than Oxford. I think Oxford was started in the 1100s and Cambridge in the 1300s, if I'm not mistaken. And so actually Cambridge has always been somewhat the secondary school. And then, is it Trinity Dublin? It became the third major university of Britain, I believe in Ireland, if I'm not mistaken. And that remained the case for a very long time, with having many colleges all around, but having three major universities. And Oxford has been considered the major one, where Carroll is from, but then Russell is starting up things at Cambridge. And that's actually, Carroll was studying in Oxford, and it was more what was happening at Cambridge, which was the scene in logic, and Carroll was a bit of an outlier. Not only in the history of logic, but also with his colleagues, and then somewhat not in Cambridge. So, an excellent book on the life and thought of Russell is the graphic novel Logic Comics. And it's Logic and Comics with an X, but all together. Logic Comics without a space. And it's a graphic novel about the life of Bertrand Russell. I highly recommend it. It is quite amusing. And Wittgenstein only comes in sporadically and as kind of an uptight jerk, which is unfortunately not hopefully the entirety of Wittgenstein, but is somewhat appropriate. He did not have the best relationship entirely with Russell, and Wittgenstein was not the best person with people. He wasn't much of a people person. Lord Bertrand Russell actually was better with people. And yet, oddly enough, it's Wittgenstein who took the turn back to the rough ground and out of formal abstraction. But as forms of life with logic, specifically the verbal forms of life, are the more or less logical, as opposed to rule-based or universal structure. But the Logic Comics is thus a book about the rough life of Russell, which he was a lord, so not that rough a life, a bit privileged, yes, in quite a position. But it is a great book about his pursuit of abstraction, of logic, and why. And it says in that book, it presents it, that as a boy, Russell feared going mad like his uncle, and he believed that reason alone would save the world and himself from madness. That is very much like the March Hare and the Mad Hatter are two separate characters, separated by a dream, the Dormouse dreaming, whereas the White Rabbit that Alice first meets, which is very absurd Aristotle, is man and beast combined. So Russell here, actually, and there is a bit of Alice in Wonderland that comes in and out, just a hint of in Logic Comics, that he wants to save himself from madness, and I would say also emotion, somewhat semantics. He wants to create knowledge without fear, or without rough ground, as Wittgenstein would say. And again, I am unfortunately not of that mind, nor do I think he is entirely. But Russell found what his grandmother had hoped to give him with strict Christian faith, which Russell very much rejected and openly professed himself to be a science-believing atheist as a British lord, and also went to jail for pacifism. So yeah, he had a very interesting life and perspective. His grandmother wanted him to be a strict Christian. That did not take, but he found in Euclid's geometric proofs what he calls delicious absolute certainty, which is actually, again, speaking of semantics and fear and such, that math is so certain it is delicious in its certainty. I do like that, although perhaps the pleasure is superfluous. So later, when he discovered that Euclid rested on axioms, which are unproven principles merely assumed to be true, Russell was deeply disappointed. But he later said that this was a defining moment of his life. He would attempt to completely ground mathematics in deduction from certainty, which for many years he believed the truth table logic of his young associate Wittgenstein would eventually do. And this is bound up with Gödel and others coming along and throwing a wrench into that. As I already mentioned last with Peano, Russell met up with Peano and then just left the conference to study Peano because he thought he could ground everything with pure abstraction and absolute certainty. Unfortunately, we do actually live in a post-Einstein, but now a post-Mandelbrot chaos, lots of complexity, which the further development of computers, ironically enough, in the work of Mandelbrot and others, would show people. I've gotten into debates with this, so I won't say with a hard claim that actually the pure rules allowing us to predict the weather months in advance have not arrived with all of the computing power. In fact, computers may be showing us how chaotic and impossible to have perfect prophecy or perfect prediction it is. And in fact, people have backed off since the 1950s, claims specifically about computers predicting what's going to happen in 2 weeks. They used to. Isaac Asimov's Foundation is a great set of sci-fi books written in the 50s I loved as a teenager, preteen. And in there they do have, it is clearly that Asimov is still living under the belief that even post-Newton with Einstein, we can figure out, and Einstein did believe in determinism, was a hard determinist, so that we will figure out the certainties and know and be able to predict the future because we'll have absolute certainty. All of that, again, is quieter now, actually, is all I'm going to tell you. So that basically, because computers have not yielded such predictions or such simple rules of things. Some may say, yes, they have plenty, and again, those are the fights I do get into with folks occasionally. So, and I have not yet done Wittgenstein, which is very much saying my piece about all of that, although I am, as you can tell, mentioning it throughout this lecture and the previous ones. I can't help it. It's like trying to sit on my hands with a marshmallow on the plate in front of me. I'm that kid, all right. You know? Delayed gratification. So onward to more Russell. So Russell found that mathematicians were all in agreement. I do love this. In spite of Russell's self, this is quite Hegelian. This is quite Hegel. Russell found that mathematicians were all in agreement, afraid to contradict each other, but afraid also to ask the deeper philosophical questions about the certainty of mathematics. Questions that had to be asked to give mathematics and thus science a firm grounding. However, as if we're going to get those Newtonian laws back from Einstein, perhaps. However, when he turned to philosophy to ask deeper questions, Russell found that the philosophers were perfectly happy to ask the deep questions, but they're all in disagreement, contradicting each other at every turn. Now, that is very science versus art, kind of Hegel, back and forth dogmatism, skepticism. There's a lot where if all the mathematicians are afraid to ask the questions but all agreeing, and the philosophers love asking the questions and love disagreeing, you have a nice spectrum of the whole very much. But Russell wants to, I think, unify the two over on one side very much for philosophy. So he wants to bring the philosophers into agreement like the mathematicians by asking the deepest of questions, plumbing the depths, and hitting bedrock. And that is one of the central ideas of Wittgenstein. There is no bedrock element, there is no basement level in which we have hit the hole and now we're done. But Russell wants to do that with the forms of pure mathematics, a la imported into or discovered and whittled away within philosophy. There's a great moment in the Logic comics where they do portray that they are leaving a meeting of British Hegelians going on in Hegelese, and I don't like Hegel. I don't like Hegelese or Heideggerese much. There are devoted fans of Hegel and devoted fans of Heidegger who love speaking like Hegel and Heidegger, and they can get very frustrating and infuriating sometimes. And Russell and G. Moore leaving a set of British Hegelians and British Hegelianism, along with, and sometimes allied with left-wing political movements, was very much the rage. And so talking like Hegel and trying to find dialectics in everything was very much the rage, and Russell leaves saying, I have no idea what any of that was, and he complains to G.E. Moore, either that or Whitehead, I believe actually it's Whitehead, I'm misreading my notes here, is that Whitehead, he says to Whitehead, and this is just the infuriating situation, the mathematicians won't ask any questions, the philosophers won't stop creating disagreement amongst themselves. he exclaims, frustrated. So Russell and G. Moore were both utterly confused and angered by the needless obscurity and abstractions of the British Hegelians. Trying to fit everything into a dialectical system is really maddening in Hegel's work. He really tries to flesh everything out with his system. And again, Nietzsche, after Kant and Hegel, kind of gets post-systemic. He says, you know what, I'm just going to make a bunch of observations and rant. I'm not going to try to form a system because I don't really trust this system building of Kant or Hegel. Neither. Russell believed that philosophy needed a Euclid to clarify the basic principles and lay the foundation, and he would be that Euclid. After discovering the work of Leibniz and Boole, Russell dedicated himself to being a logician. Russell met Peano at the 1900 Second International Conference of Mathematics in Paris, as mentioned with Peano last time, and he went straight home in the middle of the conference. As the Congress continued to study Peano's notation, as the Congress continued, he left to study Peano's notation, convinced that Peano and his students were on to the next step in mathematics and logic. Again, as I mentioned, he starts everything with zero and has a couple of rules that define how numbers work only one direction from zero following, which again kind of has problems with negative numbers and whether or not your culture has zero, actually, as I mentioned that time. But perhaps. Russell completed 300 pages of his Principles of Mathematics before discovering Frege's work, and it was then Russell had a major breakthrough. So actually we had Frege last time, and I meant Peano the time before. One of the problems of Boole and Frege's work is the problem of designation and denoting. This is throughout Alice in Wonderland also. If we say all men are mortal, do we mean all men today, all men ever? If they ain't now or ain't yet or never were, fictional men like Unicorn Man, Superman, your unborn sons who could be real but ain't yet know how contrary-wise? This is a very major problem, which Wittgenstein would say, well, when you walk into a situation and I say, well, all the men are X, Y, and Z, I could create confusion and jokes out of that, but context and situation will often set for a reasonable thinker unless I correct myself or add extra words to specifically feeling out avoiding the confusion. If I say, well, the men are going to go take a nap, you're like, all men on earth are going to go take a nap? Where will we find enough, bedding for all of that? It's like, no, that's not. We don't have confusions like this, but Chinese logic, Greek logic, and Indian logic has tricks like this, as does Lewis Carroll all throughout his work. Because when I tell you about unicorns, what am I talking about? The real unicorns, the fake unicorns, all of them, the group of unicorns I like the most, but they're fictional? Which am I talking about? Well, that's confusing in language use, and you either know and you continue on with someone, or you don't. But in logic, in Russell's kind of logic, and Lewis Carroll in his system of logic in his later work, does say, well, in logic we have to define these groups for you ahead of time. Now that's also not like real speech and communication. In real speech and communication, I sometimes, but not always, and I would take extra steps to tell you which men I am talking about, but that's only if I expect confusion. And here again, I guess in logic we expect constant confusion. But if you just say A, B, and C, you don't really need to define them. But if you do say A as in men or unicorns, now you need to say which group of what's the universe of discourse, which men, which unicorns are we talking about? Again, when we all future men, all men of the past but not present, which? It is not clear. In fact, it is arguable that language needs to be ambiguous in these ways, and that Russell is on a somewhat doomed quest here, is unfortunately my opinion. And then Wittgenstein worked with him, and then unfortunately realized he needed to work against all of this a bit, or at least complement it out and show how all this works together. Descartes argued that God has all states of perfection, and actual existence is such a state, so God must exist, which modern analytic philosophers have, thinking of Russell, compared to the argument that Superman has Xray Vision. So whatever has something, and I've done this in a classroom many a time, if you guys agree with me, that, which men are we talking about, guys? You guys, when we say Superman has X-ray vision, if you grant me that whatever has something like X-ray vision has to exist in order to have it, right? Okay, then Superman exists. Superman is real. And of course the trick is that in the situation where you know Superman has X-ray vision, you know perfectly well fictional characters can have things. But then you drag somebody 1 degree out, and with very simple words, you say, okay, having something means it exists. Well, Superman does as a fictional entity exist. If he didn't exist as a fictional entity, he couldn't have anything like fictional Xray Vision. But of course, that is the switch of the context. That is that in one situation, we know what we're talking about. And people could debate more of what that means and what that is right here. I think the Wittgensteinian kind of behavioristic approach works best, but Russell wants to iron all this out, and ultimately is somewhat frustrated that he can't. But Boole erred on one side. Boole said empty sets are simply nothing, but the class of men could refer to one or more. Carroll was in the middle, and he said we can do logic either way, and logicians simply have to be consistent with any method to be effective. Saying empty sets are still sets, or saying a set must include and refer to one or more individuals in order to be a thing. This means if we talk about unicorns, technically we are or are not making any sense at all if they do not exist. Frege fell far on the other side of Carroll and Boole. From Boole, saying that truth is purely formal, and that the phrase the man who is Superman or the King of France in the year 3000 expresses something formal that only incidentally involves actual men or objects. Frege argued that the phrases such as the King of France is bald make sense to us, but clearly refer to no one. This is actually a very famous example. I did hear this as an undergraduate in my younger years, where he says the King of France is bald. And that if I say this to you, you understand what I mean. Yes, the problem is that there is no current King of France. The British would, of course, find it particularly amusing that they actually had a resurgence of the monarchy and kept the monarchy. But the French, of course, were a bit choppy time with all of that, and they got rid of that. So there is no current King of France. The position remains vacant and open, and for no one. So the King of France is bald refers to no one. So technically, is the King of France is bald, is that false? Or is that nonsensical? That is very much part of the problem here. In a certain sense, it's not nonsensical because you understand me. If I say the King of France is bald, you're like, okay, and then what else in this hypothetical situation or whatever you're talking about? But for these guys, and they are guys, unfortunately, opening it up, maybe there are unsung women here, as in we keep hearing about it in all sorts of fields, and we will hopefully get better with all of that. But with all of this, the King of France is bald, makes sense, but it makes a kind of fictional sense, let's say. So it's not nonsense, but it is if I say, so what are we going to do with that next week? Well, unless you're selling people a fictional book, like that is nonsensical, and you can't do anything with that phrase. That's very much a Wittgensteinian understanding of nonsense, by the way. Something which is unproductive and results in no meaning or nothing. The thing is the King of France is bald does. We're talking about it right now. I'm going on and on about it. So it makes some kind of sense, and it's grammatical. It seems to import meaning in a way. How else can we have imaginary thought experiments if I don't say the King of France is bald, all right? Okay, and then there's a tree, and of course you're maybe following along before I've even said I mean this fictionally or anything like that. Because we're always in a situation or context, but, So, Russell complained that this meant, if Frege is right, this is Russell disagreeing with Frege, that saying Mont Blanc is 4,000 kilometers high would thus tell us nothing at all about the actual Mont Blanc. Russell's On Denoting from 1905, which he thought was his finest philosophical essay and one of his most important and shortest works, ought to solve this problem. I do have my students read this. Russell's essay opens with the following passage. By a denoting phrase, I mean a phrase such as any one of the following: a man, some man, any man, every man, all men, the present King of England, the present King of France, notice he includes that, the center of mass in the solar system at the first instant of the 20th century, the revolution of the earth round the sun, the revolution of the sun round the earth. Thus, a phrase is denoting solely in virtue of its form. Now, I have to say, I am a bit on Russell's side here a little, and in fact, the issue is foggy in a way that Wittgensteinian thought could just do away with it and say, well, you never have contextless abstractions complete. Even abstract math is a situation of use, and you've had math classes, and people tell you what math is before, otherwise somebody could walk up and try to use pure number where 2 plus 3 itself equals 5, and you would be more the Georgian peasant and say, what kind of a wheelbarrow and cats are we talking about? You would not know, well, I don't do abstractions for no reason. Why are we doing this? Again, somebody walks up to you in a bus station, starts talking math, it would not make much sense. So, yes. He says, we may distinguish three cases. First, a phrase may be denoting and yet not denote anything, namely the present King of France, and so he thinks he takes care of that problem. 2, a phrase may denote one definite object, namely the present King of England, denotes a certain man, so he thus solves that. He thinks this is very Avicenna. I have yet to do that video. I need to back up and do that, the Avicenna. But Avicenna says you have a concept of unicorns, you have a concept of horses. Your concept of unicorns does not apply to, is just as real as your concept of horses and works the same way. But Avicenna emphasizes the imagination in the Islamic world as their central, one of, if not their central philosopher, inspirational figures of the history of Islamic thought. And says, then your concept of a unicorn is real, but there are no unicorns that correspond to your concept like there are horses that correspond, and we understand this, you and I. So that's what Avicenna says, and this is not actually that far from it, although we can split hairs and try to define our terms endlessly here, because again, Wittgenstein wouldn't so much. So 3, a phrase may denote ambiguously. And again, there's too much here that's just all of this. Even if you say the present King of France, what if, again, there's 2 of them they swap out and we meant the one that just swapped out last week? We didn't say anything about what politics are or aren't. A phrase may denote ambiguously, namely, a man denotes not many men, but an ambiguous man. There's not, and then how do we have more definition here? The interpretation of such phrases is a matter of considerable difficulty. Well, that's odd also. I have to jump in here. Children figure this out. So how is it a matter of considerable difficulty? Do we need formal logic to help children such that they learn language? Indeed, it is very hard to frame any theory not susceptible of formal refutation. I'm going to leave that again with Wittgenstein until later. All the difficulties with which I am acquainted are met, so far as I can discover, by the theory with which I am about to explain. Russell then argues we can speak certainly and scientifically about things we never meet or know personally, such as the center of mass of the solar system, but still speak as if they are definite things that are shared and real in our world, such that we do not need to sense them or know that we are exclusively referring to them together, meaning the same thing with our words. We do not even see into others' minds, but simply behave with them as if we are in agreement as we speak and listen to each other. Russell says that propositions are either always, sometimes, or never true. And if we say all men are mortal, we assert it as if it is always true. But when we say we met a man and we have not met each man, we are saying we met an X is a man, and what we say is sometimes true at least once in the meeting of the particular man. Now, this is setting up Wittgenstein to somewhat wander with this very same sort of thinking past Russell thinking there's 3 separate types. I think Wittgenstein could say we could imagine a society in which there are those 3 of Russell, but it would be a very limited, not limited as in tribal people are limited, but it would be a very interesting civilization and or tribe. With those 3, we would notice it because we are actually more variable than that, and it would seem stilted, I think Wittgenstein would say. So what happens, Russell asks, when we use the word the? This is another good Wittgensteinian proto-problem. Wittgenstein later says in the Philosophical Investigations, when we say the word the, which is like the duck, and you know what it means in Alice, which I will get to with Wittgenstein, because again, that is a wonderful Wittgensteinian crossover with Carroll. The word the, we understand the word 2 ways without thinking or choosing either one, such that we may not notice the first the refers to the second, the word the. If I say the word the, how much do you need to think in order to hear that word 2 different ways? Well, you just hear the word 2 different ways if you understand what I mean when I say the word the. Because I said the, you mean, oh, okay, so it's referring to a specific thing. Word the. Well, the second the is just talking about itself as a word. Yes? Or however we could say that. So, effortlessly, you just hear them in situation. I go on and on about how we hear or inclusively or exclusively. I love talking about this without a thought to it. And that has fascinated me since I was an undergrad. Ever since I heard that in formal logic, and then really that does bridge all the way out through Carroll to Wittgenstein for me. If you hear or so quickly in opposite ways, and I had no idea I was, until I learned it in college. I did not know I was using or in 2 different ways. We could say stretchy 2 ways, at least 2 ways. Why did I not know that? Why did I not know that? I think the Wittgensteinian answer is we're behavioristically conditioned to snap into situations, and we need not have them structured in our skulls at much, in so far as an intentionally designed structure by ourselves. We don't need to give form much to knowledge or practice, which is weird when you start to look at it, because our eyes are very shut to a lot that can give us much vertigo, that we don't actually plan out much, and yet much seems to rise right up under our feet, as Nietzsche says about the words, that we don't think out, but we speak, and words come to us. So, if we say the father of Charles II, who would be the beheaded Charles I, as Russell gets into, we are excluding everyone but one possible man. Now notice, actually, I do want to point out, Russell keeps joking about the King of France who doesn't exist, and then he says if we say the father of Charles II, Russell is actually joking as a British lord here, tongue-in-cheek a bit. He's somewhat saying whether or not he likes it, I'm not going to call. We didn't really get rid of our king the way the French did, because he is joking, and he is consistent here. Oh, the father of Charles II would be Charles I was killed. Charles II restored the monarchy and came back from France to restore, was protected by French people, came back from France and restored the British monarchy, ironically enough. So, yeah, that's fun. It's Russell keeps joking. There is a king of France. There is not a king of France. There is still a king of England, though, because they succeeded. Yes? Russell says that we must formally add, and does not mention how this is done, X was the father of Charles II, and if Y is the father of Charles II, then X is identical, Y is identical with X. This is actually, again, Wittgenstein would say maybe something of a form similar is what happens, but it would be very strange if we did this kind of math in our head, especially if tribal people did this kind of math in their head to do basic reasoning before mathematics. That would be very, very interesting, but Russell wants to give this mathematical form. Russell says he is not at present giving reasons, but merely stating the theory, which seems irreducible to him. Now, I just have to say, there's so much ambiguity floating out here, other than the pure core of the theory, and then the pure theory itself is irreducible to him and does not resolve many, many problems. Now, Wittgenstein would come along and say, yeah, that's because this pure core need not exist. There are simply rough, somewhat certain, somewhat uncertain forms of life. It doesn't need to be, life does not, and any of its forms need to be irreducible, like to one level. But that is what Russell is trying to accomplish with algebraic mathematical forms, post Avicenna and the Muslims. So it is unclear how, if X can refer to more than one individual, why Y cannot as well. This actually kicks the can down the road for in the ways Russell's theory of types does somewhat, because it just creates the problem somewhere else, which actually is very much like the Mad Tea Party. They're going around in a circle. We'll just worry about, I don't know, we'll worry about place settings later. In a certain sense, yeah, we don't ever have to worry about the problem if we just abstractly put it in somewhere else with all the ambiguity. Quite irreducible. Yeah, that's not a good thing necessarily. So Russell argues the present King of France, again, twisting the knife, is a meaningful statement. I guess a guillotine doesn't twist, but you know what I mean. It's not really a backflip. So, the present King of France is a meaningful statement that refers to no one and nothing, just as the statement a round square does not refer to any particular existing thing. But the present King of England, he says, once again, refers to one and no one else, which seems an indirect, again, way of reminding the French Charles II restored the British monarchy and Napoleon did not so much. Nor did the third. Perhaps Russell is still sore about the Battle of Waterloo, or he doesn't like the station. Russell says Frege is wrong to completely separate meaning and denotation, as if the content in a phrase indicating it applies to nothing, one thing, some things, or everything is independent of the rest of what is logical and certain. And the reasons that if Frege is right, then the present King of France is bald is either true or false according to the principle of bivalence, which is a good thing to bring up, but unfortunately is something you could bring up with Russell a bit. It's also known as the excluded middle. Now, the present King of France is bald and the present King of France is not bald are not true or false. If one is true, then the other should be false. And the present King of France is bald is just as true and untrue as the present King of France is not bald. That does seem intuitive, that if they're both fiction, then they're both equally true, false, or what have you, whenever we're saying one and not the other. Now, in a fictional... interestingly enough, if the present King of France is bald and I say the present King of France is not bald, I'm wrong, right? Yes. So actually they could, and bivalence can work if we set one up ahead of time, yes, in the situation, as the situation. But the first and second statements refer to no individual at all, and so neither can be strictly true in the real world for Russell, of course. And so he says Frege cannot account for this. Russell mocks Hegelians, saying that if they love a synthesis in the middle, and would probably conclude the present king of France wears a wig, and so he is both bald and not, which is funny, is very Hegelian dialectics, and non-existence as a very specific determinate kind of being. Wearing a wig is a determinate kind of non-baldness, but it is still the baldness beneath, but not the wig, but not like you. So, with all of this, yeah, that is funny. And Russell is mocking wigs and France and, hereditary. So in Russell's The Problems of Philosophy from 1912, he begins asking if knowledge can be so certain that no one can doubt it. We assume many things are true all day long, just as Descartes says he seems to be sitting by the fire, but it could be a deceiving demon or a mad scientist. Descartes uses, as I like to mention, a man of great industry, which is basically a mad scientist, would poke your brain or your mind and make you think things. Russell says that he seems to be sitting at a desk writing on white sheets of paper with the sun shining outside through the window. This is very Locke. I'm sure Russell knows that, and he believes that the sun is a hot ball of gas, which will continue to rise as the Earth circles it for many, many years to come. Now, funny enough, he definitely knows that he's a bit of Descartes and a bit Locke here, and both of them are like, and God's real, we know that, scientific fact. And he says, and the sun is a hot ball of gas. Here again, we have a bit of, it's like he's concerned with the King of France and not the King of France, and the King of still of England. And he very much is bringing up things like God and the sun or not, which again is interesting, yes, quite the ray. And, it's a ray, a straight line of truth here, running through it, like Wittgenstein's cord and the threads. So he says if others walk into his room and see and believe in a world similar to his, all of this can be doubted, though, as Descartes said in the opening of his Meditations at the dawn of modern European philosophy, and Russell is hearkening back to him and trying to be his own Descartes here. Russell says we can judge with our eyes that a particular thing is smooth, brown, rectangular, wooden table. We can use words to describe it, and others agree with this description. But as soon as we try to be more precise than this, we have problems. An actual table is not uniformly brown, perfectly smooth, or absolutely rectangular. And others can view the table in different lights from different points of view. While we and others use common sense to simply say the table is brown, it is not simply brown to the painter or to the philosopher, he says. And that definitely is a wonderful Wittgensteinian point, but he isn't taking it there. Appearance and reality are not simply the same, and while the painter looks beyond common sense to study the ways things actually appear, the philosopher, Russell says, looks beyond common sense to study the ways things actually are. I agree, but they are and are not, of course, a bit here, and Russell is and isn't a bit. So Russell gives the name sense data. I have a very big problem with this, and I think Wittgenstein does too. At least a Wittgensteinian point of view does. So, sense data, and we definitely in analytic philosophy in the Americas, you will often hear perception referred to as data. I have to be the Wittgenstein and the Wittgensteinian here and say perception does not look like, or we don't use it like data. Data looks like spreadsheets or like writings or scribblings or notes. Trees don't look like data, and there is a very serious confusion that happens when you say trees consist of data or senses consist of data. That assumes we're a machine and we have machine information that is designed to be information already there. That is a sleight of hand, which we could say in academics is problematic. But I'm going to leave that there, and I'm just going to say I don't like this at all. But Russell gives the name sense data to the particular sensations we have of colors, textures, and shapes. When you see the color red, is that data? Slow down and think out what the implications of saying yes or no is, and I don't mean we'd all be immoral people and treat others as machines. That's not actually the point. The point is that accurately describing what's going on in thinking and knowledge? Data. Can you have knowledge without data? No, yes. How does this work? Is it all consisting of data? And he says we immediately know this in sensations. So my knowing red by seeing red and not thinking any words is data? Okay, it's not, we know it's an experience, but is it experienced as data? If you're not doing science with it, or observation, or self-reporting, or something, and then taking notes, which notes are data, I would say. Certainly, writing, scribblings, numbers, words can be data. That's what it looks like. If you say, bring me the data, and I brought you a tree, I would be a very strange person. But again, words are variable, and that's where the magic happens here, as always. So, even though ancient Greek skeptics that Descartes discussed said no sensation happens immediately without any mediation, so Russell also believes that our perception is immediate. Just bang, it's data right there, certain. He's going to try to do a bit of a think therefore I am with Descartes, following Descartes here. He's going to say, but it's just so known to me immediately that objectively that's the color red, and data-wise, like science, therefore our world's very scientific outside of us. And the problem is that seeing red is not taking down objective data. That is, well, as the Taoists say, you're basically seeing a crossbow pellet and demanding a roast dove immediately. Like, there's something where you might want to slow down here. And as the Taoists say, pay attention to what most leap over as they go for fine food and fancy music. So Russell says we know the table by way of the sense data. So the table is data. Or our mind breaking the table into any understanding is data. As if the data is the thing and its medium. So the data itself is the immediate medium through which we sense and know things, such as the table, the mind as reality itself. And thus, I guess when the mind sees red, it is true data. And here, I guess if we hallucinate, we truly have data as a fake hallucination. While Russell equates idealism with the denial of the independent external world, he says philosophy at least shows us what strange possibilities for thought lurk in typically unexamined tables. Well, actually, yeah, he's brought up data invisibly lurking in it, actually, and now he's created problems that I hope Wittgenstein says are false problems you can really look past. Much like I have to say, and I did with Mill, Russell says, well, if I'm a skeptic, then I may as well question whether or not I had coffee today. Yes, right here. And I may as well question if I just drank coffee right then. And of course, a skeptic and a pragmatist would say, but that's not important right now. You know, it's a hospital. What is it? Well, it's a big building with patients, Cindy, but that's not important right now. So it's again, although I guess if everything's just immediate data, then whether or not the red's a hallucination or real, it is just real red, yes. And then that's written down where? Your mind, your memory? Again, we need to, I think psychologists especially have gotten to the point, and it is very Wittgensteinian to bring up here. Our mind is not a video camera that records pure data. Our mind interweaves with imagination, our memories, reweaves them every time. I do like that from psychology. And I grew up in the 80s and in the Haight-Ashbury when people were worried about false memories of interviewing preschoolers and giving them false memories about Satanists, if you know all of that. That disappeared, and now we have QAnon and stuff. So with all of that stuff, of course, and speaking of lots of sense data and givens and what have yous, that's, or not so givens, that with all of this, it's again, well, yeah. How do we get here to the pure facts and the pure knowledge and the pure sense data of what we just randomly see or think is a table? The problem, as Wittgenstein will mention here, and I will just mention this for a moment, is what Russell is doing is he is treating the mind as if the mind is a computer that contains everything in a single form of information, and that we could break the world down into the data of our computer minds, and when we do with Boolean telephone systems and increasing computer systems, we will then have the bedrock level of data, which is our brains and minds and lives. The problem with this is there is no bedrock form of data that is read and math altogether that we can boil everything down to and whittle away to the pure truth that allows us to perfectly predict what 2 weeks from now will be. But that remains the situation in spite of whether or not you side with Russell, myself, Wittgenstein, or whomever, and I do have to raise these problems because Russell is raising these problems with Frege and with previous thinkers, specifically Mill, taking the side of Frege but raising problems against Frege. And so I have to do that same to Russell and Frege in the name of later Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein didn't like this, didn't like it entirely, did what Russell is doing here, tried to make it fit, disagreeing with Russell but agreeing with him and with Frege, but eventually abandoned this entire perspective. And I do believe he is right, and we will be going through many examples carefully and slowly with that. So common sense tells us tables exist when we leave the room and that sense data is no longer immediate. By the way, common sense here, I think it consists of feelings a lot and emotions as semantics, etc. We just have a bunch of the situation ambiguously is ambiguity and common sense for Russell. It's this mysterious ghost of common sense snaps us into the color red is red. Now I talk about it good or funny. And it's just, there's just this mystical common sense which seems to enter in wherever science or our conscious minds aren't. And again, it's Russell wants to get over those sorts of gray area explanations. So sense data is no longer immediate, so then I know my memories are correct just immediately because I have them and I'm certain of them. Well, that's not just real individual life in anybody. And that we all see the same table, even as we see it from different points of view. Well, that you could be wrong about as well. What if there's a second table behind the first and I'm not seeing the same table? There's just too many points where your certainty may be immediate but may be wrong. And that is very Wittgenstein and why he says we always leave the window open. And we only describe possibilities here. As Poe says, the most brilliant of things are possibility, not certainty. It seems absurd to think that tables disappear when not seen or that there are many tables as there are viewers. But philosophy should not fear absurdities, Russell says here. I have to say that is quite ironic given how I am presenting the material, at least, because he fears absurdity and gray areas, doesn't want to go mad with too much emotion or fear, and then loves delicious certainty and thinks common sense fills in everything such that this is now no longer absurd. I am certainly not presenting it that way. There seem to be independent public objects observable to many in common, but this also seems so in a dream when it is not actually real, as he brings up. We cannot prove the independent existence of our world and the things in it, but we naturally assume this instinctive belief that, and there is no good reason for rejecting it. He says, and he admits this argument is weak. However, it's weak and strong, I would say, in a Wittgensteinian sense, because it's actual and it's apparent, but it does not admit of pure foundational certainty, and neither do the things you think entirely. So, at least most. Why would you think pure certainty to pure certainty all day long for what? You should have banked that last week. Especially if it's unchanging. Did you just discover the pure certainty today? Like, you should have already put that together. And so should have society, right? Russell admits that this argument is weak, but argues that we cannot know anything. This is a constant refrain of dogmatism. Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Russell, much, and Descartes between them is French. Before they knocked off the king. Russell admits that this argument is weak, but argues we cannot know anything with certainty. If we throw out all instinctive belief, now oddly enough, without the gray area kind of emotive and thus shoving us in here with our instincts and our emotions and our feelings of context, we would know nothing. And if we use philosophy to separate our stronger instinctive beliefs, stronger relatively instinctive beliefs from weaker instinctive beliefs and beliefs that seem to be true but are not, to leave us with a harmonious system of clarified, isolated, and identified beliefs without contradictions and clashes between them. Russell argues, much like Gautama and Aristotle in ancient times, that if nothing contradicts our beliefs, including our beliefs with themselves, we have the best reasons possible to believe the total whole is coherently certain and true. I would agree, but again, I don't think that supports his position well. He does admit it doesn't, but he does in a way that I think really undermines pretty much the force of everything he is saying positively. By positive, I mean that he's asserting, not that I like it. Russell argues that if we want to know anything other than the obvious and immediate, we need to gather things in our conceptions into general principles. General Hospital, what is it? We can perceive lightning following thunder again and again, but we must draw a general principle from this if we want to know the relationship between the two. Russell admits that this creates a problem, what he calls the problem of induction. I think the problem of induction is very much the death knell for him and the opening of later Wittgenstein. But if we only know general principles by induction, through experience, then how can we know anything for absolute certain? Russell argues we must found our understandings in the principle of the uniformity of nature, the object of all science. The uniformity of nature, the object of all science. One of the very strange things, I forget who says this entirely. I know Lakoff and Johnson bring it up. In context, sometimes and I've mentioned this with my opening lectures on logic, we oftentimes privilege the positive or the certain. Here is certainty, let's call it a positive term, as opposed to uncertainty. We could say freedom, and it's a kind of uncertainty which actually is positive, and then we privilege that as a positive term. So it depends how we phrase things and what words we're using. But is uniformity as opposed to diversity the object of all of science? Is understanding how things are the same as opposing to understanding how things diverge the object as opposed to the openness, notice the positive in object, of all science? Well, here again, we are phrasing it as if what we're after is truth rather than lies or falsehood or error. Well, we're after everything continuously as a form of life. We're not actually after a society in which everyone only says true things if you stop and think about it. That can't happen. And if you say it should, there's problems here that are actually of a similar nature. I'm not going to get into whether or not we should never lie, which is very Kantian morality, in fact. Brings it back to Kant and recircles him into this. Uniformity and completely systematic coherence is the object of all science. So remember, science is investigation, and we call it the sciences and is professionalized somewhat, rather than being somewhat a pastime practice, is now very much a profession. The object of science is to systematize and unify nature into a human conception. I am simply going to say, I don't think that's simply, that is very much an object of science. That is not simply the object of science, the positive as opposed to the negative. That's almost like saying, in science we ignore anything that turns out to be a lie entirely and don't speak of it. We only speak of the true. That simply cannot happen. But that's interrelated, not exactly the same thing. Russell admits, however, we are never far from the position of the chicken. I do agree. Who is sure that nature is uniform and she will continue to be fed each day, even the day when her neck will be wrung, sadly, and she is served as food herself. The sad thing here is if I tell you, well, the color red will remain red forever, right? It won't turn into a strange shade of green. Now we have terrible science fiction, which does not mean it can happen, but that we can imagine it. And if we can imagine it, unfortunately, that's what we do philosophy with, very much thought experiments, we say after Wittgenstein, but Russell's doing a lot of thinking here, a lot of thought experiments, isn't he? A lot of examples, imaginary. And using imaginary examples, I've used Superman. He doesn't, of course. Superman's more the 1930s, actually, so Russell could know of that later, after these works. But, yeah. Is the color red is always going to remain the color red? Well, if your neck is gone tomorrow, like the King of France, notice it is a bit of the King of France again, right? And he is a bit bald, in fact. A little too much. A little off the top, you know? I'm sure someone else has made that joke before. Too much off the top, a little too relative for Russell. So the position, yeah, the chicken's like, oh, red's the color red. That's pure data. Yeah, but red may not be red tomorrow for the chicken or anybody the chicken knows because the chicken isn't going to know anybody tomorrow, you know? So what if our eyes go out? Or what if, the color green ceases to exist because brain states or anything? Here the problem is that, yeah, but unfortunately this is the problem of induction. We're always the chicken. I do like in the middle of Ram Dass, the Harvard psychologist who was hung out with Timothy Leary and, did a lot of things, including change his name to Ram Dass and go to India a bunch, is he has a page in the middle of his Be Here Now, which is a hippie classic, The Chicken Sees. And there's just a chicken there, and it's just a giant sort of stamped, everything in the book is stamped, actually, not written out. All the text and the images are stamped or drawn in. And there is a stamped old-timey chicken, and it just says in stamps, The Chicken Sees. And yes, there we have it. Unfortunately, sees enough anyway, until the day. Unfortunately for Russell, he was writing the piece before the work of Einstein, when Newton's laws of nature were the dominant model of science and physics. Einstein's work did much to swing scientists away from the use of the word law, you will notice, towards the use of the word theory, and to describe proposed conceptions of the regularity of nature, humanity, and the universe. Now, I certainly want to stand up for the sciences here. Anybody who says, oh, science is merely theory, yeah, let's just say here for a second, yeah, that's all of thought here is what we're saying is theory, of course, according to me, and I'm more skeptical than Russell. So, no, that doesn't mean science is mere theory, so why don't you ignore what it says on the milk carton or your medication? No, the thinking behind your medication works for you or not is theory, yes, is control trials, is figuring it out. That doesn't mean shamans or science didn't know anything, And again, I tend to equate shamans with science more than others do at all, rather than just throw the two in completely different rational, irrational baskets. I do not like. But yeah, you can unfortunately see that with Russell is still laboring as if we're going to get Newtonian laws, and that's going to unify the system of science. What's happening here is Einstein leading to Gödel, leading away from that, actually, somewhat. So we still have that, plenty. So in spite of this, though, you will still frequently hear scientists and scholars refer to the laws of nature, following Newton, who shared with Plato and Aristotle a teleological view of the universe. Russell's an atheist, but Plato and Aristotle believe in a polytheistic universe in which increasingly it's more monotheistic, and something like an abstract Zeus has a plan of everything as an all-father, such that our world behaves according to coherent mathematical laws for Russell, and Descartes, who is a theist and a mathematician, who with the Cartesian, he was quite coordinated. So mathematical laws were that were intelligently designed for the ancients, not by the and many moderns, not by the ideal mind or the gathering of experience with Russell, but by the universe being lawful. That's another big problem here. Why is the universe lawful? Because it looks that way-ish. Descartes argued much like Russell, but for the objectivity of reason, logic, mathematics, science, but also the authority of the Catholic Church and truth of its theological doctrines. And guess what? We didn't hear much contradiction of that either. So, hey, must be true. You don't hear anything against it. Russell, an open atheist, argues that Descartes' arguments hold for science, but not for religion. Yeah, well, he's a Protestant and post that. So he does not believe in the Catholic Church the way Descartes argued for. It's quite a, again, as, Groucho Marx says, marriage is a fine institution, but who wants to live in an institution? In the empiricist answer to skepticism, I am going to push through here because we only have a few more paragraphs, and I am treading upon the hour, as I know, and I try not to make these, try to make these shorter rather than longer. But in the empiricist answer to skepticism, now notice the empiricist, it's induction, problem of induction, answer to skepticism, I like skepticism. Well, what do you know perfectly? Some and some. So he wants all or none, but he wants it inductively with science and induction. But he's already said how really we're always in the position of the chicken, right? So in the answer to skepticism, I don't have the year of that text right here, actually. Russell calls out, but it is later. I believe I put the texts in order of Russell writing them. Russell calls out Hegelians and skeptics by name and says we cannot get to the sort of independent certainties we want to call facts or laws by their methods. Well, that's right. But we can in any way get to absolute certainties, possibly, says the skeptic. Russell says that we can whittle away at our theories to get to the pure data, whittle down away the subjective, and leave the exclusive objective. I do not believe you can do that. The facts beneath interpretation, much as Frege thought logic worked beyond Boole. Russell has faith in a minimal theory, and though he concedes to the Hegelians and skeptics that there is always some uncertainty in truth, some room for error, Wittgenstein says, leave the window cracked. Leave the window open, which is some 99.99 in expression, and thus in theory. Russell argues some data has independent credibility, seemingly known in itself, like the Kantian thing in itself, but one that's right in our face and we know. Kant says we can't know the thing in itself. Russell is like, the color red is so real to me, I know that's red on the fire truck. It has independent credibility. Now, Wittgenstein says if you can't trust your eyes, you look outside, you see whales floating through the sky, all majestic, you would turn to your friend and say, are you seeing this? I'm not trusting my eyes. And if those whales look absolutely real because you're on amazing, strange drugs, well, unfortunately, what is independent credibility? Does data talk? See, here again, the problem is Russell has talked about everything as if it all boils down to talk and it's secretly in paragraphs in the brain. That is very much what Wittgenstein turns against. So how can certain data, and this is a method of expression, I understand, but he slips into it and takes his metaphors a little bit literally, one could claim and argue. Some data has independent credibility. Try to think of an example in which some data has independent credibility and set it up such that that's credible for yourself. I can't get anywhere near there, and I do not mean that there's more or less certain science, because I think there is more or less certain science, but what data has independent credibility? That means data is trustworthy and has good character, or doesn't lie often. I don't know what kind of homunculi Russell is or isn't seeing out his window or deep in the truth itself, but again, I don't know how the truth can talk to you or tell you itself. It again seems rather teleological. Russell seems thoroughly teleological and quite Newtonian. And Newton believed God pokes his finger in to the universe to reset things every so often and wouldn't let the universe go out because the universe is still here and it would have gone out. So I guess that's very much God keeping it going. Russell would not like that kind of reasoning. He'd think it all a ball of hot, fiery gas or what have you. So, yeah. Anyway, again, I am not trying to argue theistically or atheistically, by the way. I do believe in abstaining from that and being agnostic very much. I am quite agnostic, actually. Thank you for asking. But with all of this, it's not about the theism or the atheism, although I do bring that in shamelessly because I think it's important. In historical context, it's quite amazing that Russell is trying to play Descartes and I think falls for exactly the same problems. Or at least falls right into them. So he says we should give the greatest weight, that's a relative qualifier, to that which is most regular and most certain, and in this way form our principles and propositions. Now I have to say here cynically, arithmetic is not done perfectly all times. We can make mistakes that are very stupid in writing out very quickly 2 plus 3 equals 5. In fact, we probably don't even try to write out 2 plus 3 equals 5. So there is not the perfect practice of arithmetic, and it is very much Russell to say, but ideally it exists elsewhere. Where? Russell wrote, the business of philosophy, as I conceive of it, is essentially that of logical analysis, followed by logical synthesis, very Kantian, very neo-Kantian, very proto-analytic. We should take things completely apart into their basic components to atomize them. Can we atomize things? This is very much why Wittgenstein says, if I call for a broom, I'm calling for the broom and the broom handle, but I'm not saying so. Can we atomize things into the fundamental pieces, atoms, broom handles, and then build the thing into the combinations of the parts that show how it works in all of its possibilities? Can't do that for late Wittgenstein. I don't know all the possibility of brooms, nor do I want to. That's not my purpose here. This follows the entire project of Hegel, but in total rejection of contradiction, which Hegel sees in every step as essential, as unification. For Russell, analysis is less definition than reduction. Logical reconstruction substitutes known certain entities for unknown, unsure ones, until the whole is analyzed and then synthesizes out of basics that can be sensed in the world, a position Russell called logical atomism. Now, logical atomism is important because I think the opening pages of the Philosophical Investigations, which I'm going to get deep into very soon. Finishing Russell, we're going to go on to early Wittgenstein and then and Wittgenstein's life, and then I'm going to do a lot of videos on late Wittgenstein. Late Wittgenstein is very much a position against Russell's logical atomism. There are brooms, there are broom handles. For now, there are brushes of brooms. Thus, in a certain sense for Wittgenstein, already with such a simple world with a few brooms in it, we have, and us using brooms or broom handles and not knowing we're calling for a broom handle specifically when we call for the broom, Russell is wrong about logical atomism. There simply are not basic components of things if I can look at the broom as atoms or not, if I need to look at the brooms as atoms or not. Then the broom essentially is atomized into atoms or the two parts, depending on the situation. The Wittgensteinian answer is you are wrong to look for walking into a situation and seeing all possibilities of apples. You are seeing the possibilities of apples in that situation. You have no reason to think with a brain that sees all possibilities of apples. I would say even scientists who insist, but I did and therefore I came up with a great theory, you saw more possibilities of apples. I do not know how you could have gone through all of them. There are potentially infinite possibilities of apples because you bring up pears and now there's more possibilities of that. Now I bring up trucks. Now I bring up labor practices. There's just no end to things. So, and then 3 things creates chaotic possibilities. So what logical atomism into what book that is the final possibilities of apples or what? Each book about apples could be rewritten in different ways. Unfortunately, there's a problem of whether or not we can atomize things entirely, and I'm going to call this, again, Wittgenstein's broom. And I'm going to go into detailed videos about each of the concrete allusions and thought metaphors of Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein's broom sweeps this much away from me. And I essentially, again, mentioned this, and yes, I just sort of rattled off what I'm saying. Russell's protege, Wittgenstein, argued in his later work that if we call for a broom, we are calling for the broom handle and brush, but not separately. That's not what we're intentionally doing. We are effectively doing that, and somebody could joke about it, though, and we could joke about it because we know that we're not calling for the handle. So we are calling for all the atoms of the broom, but not in that way or for any atomic purpose. how many possibilities do you have for lunch right now? It's like, do you need to know all of them? In the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein suggests that the pieces in a chess game could be atomized and categorized differently as the game goes on, with the interests and positions shifting, and that's a chessboard. A chessboard is nice and defined as compared to a picnic lunch basket. So, if the pieces that jump suddenly become more important in a certain situation, you can't atomize them all for all purposes. Yeah, you can say, and I've had students say before, but if I go around the elephant entirely, of course the blind man and the elephant, yes, but now I've gone around the elephant entirely. What if something has changed on the other side of the elephant you're not seeing right now? What if there's been a world war on the side of the elephant you're not looking at? What if a foot gets cut off? There's too many simple counter arguments and examples. Wittgenstein thus says part of the problem with thought is we use too few examples, and I will get into a lot of different thought experiments with Wittgenstein because he uses so many rich examples that provide ambiguity and show the ambiguity, the gray areas of thought, specifically the ones Russell wants to sweep away with atomism. Atoms themselves used to be uncuttables, which is why they're called atoms, cannot be cut. As soon as we split the atom, we should have called it something else we didn't. So oddly enough, Russell wants atomism, and atoms themselves are not fully atomic or completely discrete. They have indiscretions, enthusiasms. Maybe they're suggesting things independently as data. I don't know. I don't think so, though. I don't talk to atoms that way. I have a friend, actually. I need to say hello to him. He had a birthday. I haven't said hey. So hey, but I'll call him. He probably would not be seeing this. But with all of that and atomism, and again, maintaining friendships, as flawed as I am here with this all could be a fatal flaw to Russell's logical atomism, even if the shifting situation can, moment by moment, be atomized in particular passing context. We certainly do atomize things together such that 2 + 3 certainly equals 5 in situations. The problem is, how do we know that forever? We need not with Wittgenstein. So we will pass onward specifically to him. So much love and happiness. Thank you for sticking through the hour with me about Russell. I did have to go on many a tangent because this is what sets up Wittgenstein, and he is my most favorite. And he is a guy, and I heard more than one person teaching me at Berkeley say, whoever becomes the greater Wittgenstein is going to get quite a lot of human thought. And Wittgenstein wanted to, and unfortunately he died of cancer rearranging his notebooks for himself and told his students to keep doing that, if they would, and if they wanted to. And I want to keep rearranging his notebooks. And that is what I'm going to continue to do for you. And it's very much going to be all about the early to the later and anti-atomism like this, and sweeping it away a bit with Wittgenstein's broom and leaving a bit of Wittgenstein's window open. Always. Any way we can. Because you can still close up things decently with certainty while always leaving windows open. 99.99%, etc. Yes? As the expressions and the words go, whether or not I am fully trustable to you. So much love, much happiness, and as always, I will see you, if I ever do manage to see you.